All right, so with Project One, we introduced the basic painting technique we're going to use throughout the semester. And this is one I've kind of worked it up in a way that you can do it without a tablet or you can do it with a tablet. It's a concept that works. It works well either way. If you're doing purely digital or incorporating traditional materials. Also, it works across any imaging software, raster imaging software that has layers and layer modes available to you. Something like GIMP does, Affinity Photo. There are other painting packages that do that. If you've got an iPad, you could use Procreate on an iPad, which is what I use for 90% of my work. But Photoshop is probably the one most people are familiar with and have access to. But this, like I say, will work with multiple applications. So if you've watched the thumbnail video, it should have gotten you to the point where you've got your drawing scanned or photographed and adjusted in Photoshop so that you've got a good quality image to start with. Now I'll take you through the basics of this technique. So you've got your image. This assignment requires an 8 by 10 inch image, 300 pixels per inch. When I photographed my image, it came in at a different size. Okay, I can just look at that and tell. So what I need to do first thing is I'm going to go to File and do a new file, new document. And I could go ahead and call it Project 1. And actually I think I would be Stanley Project 1. Here you have your width and height settings. By default, I think it'll be set in pixels. You want to set that to inches. And you want to set your width for 8 or for 10 and your height for 8. If you want a horizontal, if you want a vertical, and you can choose whatever fits your image best, we'll do horizontal. And for your resolution, you want to make sure this is set to 300 pixels per inch. Your pixels per inch determines how much detail, how much information is in your image. The higher this is, the higher resolution you have, the more detail you can have in your image. So that's the basics of that. We'll get into that more later in the semester where you have a better understanding of resolution. But for right now, if you'll use these settings, you should be good to go. Color mode should be RGB, and we create. And there's our new 8 by 10 image. So I've got that, and then I've got my Photoshop file of my drawing. What I want to do is go to File, or actually go to Select All, or I can use the key command, which is Command A on the keyboard. I'll encourage you to learn your key commands because it saves you from always having to be hopping up here to the menu and find something. So I'll do Select, and we see the selection around the entire image. Those little marching ant dots are what those are called, marching ants. That's the area that's selected. I'll go to Edit, Copy, or Command C. Then I'll go to my new project, and you'll, with your layer menu open, which you need to make sure it's open. If it's not open, go to your window menu, find layers. There it is. You'll see you have a background. When I go to Edit and Paste or Command V, it'll put my image there. You'll see that it comes in on its own new layer. And it comes in this case, at a particular size. What I want to do is if I paste that and I want to resize it, as soon as I paste it, I want to go to Edit, Transform, or Free Transform, or Command T. That gives me a bounding box around the entire image, and then I can grab a corner and scale it proportionally. So I want to do that and fit it, think about your composition on your page. And then I can move it. And I like to have a decent margin around my image. And since this is just going to be a portrait, I want to consider that. If I were going to have like the character in an environment, I might have a different composition. But this works for this. So I'll position that and hit enter on my keyboard. It applies that transformation. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the layer menu, click here, in the box here, and go to merge down. And that's going to combine those two layers into one. Okay, so that's my starting point. Now, typically, you know, if this were traditional, what you would do is you would do your drawing, and then you would go in and maybe load your paint on your brush, pick your color, and go in. And let's see, let's get a good brush here. Get our opacity turned up. You know, in traditional media, you'd go in and try to color and not go outside the lines, I guess is the term you'd be familiar with, right? If you try to do that with this project, you will drive yourself a little nutty. We want to make it easier for you to do, because what happens is when you do that, you're working on this one layer, the background here, right? And then every paint stroke you put, you are affecting your original drawing, which means if I paint over something, you know, it's gone, or I have to undo and lose my work. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a technique that's non-destructive, okay, where it's going to allow you to work on top of your image and not damage it or risk messing it up. So you've got your background layer. What we want to do in the layers palette is create a new layer. Click on the plus button. It puts a new transparent layer above. All right. So anytime you see these checkerboards in Photoshop, that means it's transparent. There are no pixels at all on that layer. That's why when I turn the bottom layer on, I can see through to that. Now if I just go in and start painting on this and turn off the background layer, you can see the pixels I've added to this layer. Okay, so already we're a little bit better off in that we can go in and paint on top of this without worrying about messing up the layer underneath, right? But I still have the issue of, well, I'm having to get right up on this line, and then I put on all this hatching in my pencil drawing, and I'm painting over the top of that. Now I could try to go in and paint in between those, and again, that's maddening, right? That's not what you want to do. With Photoshop, each layer has the ability to adjust its layer mode, right? What that means is it changes the way a layer interacts with the layer underneath it, right? So if I just go in and don't worry about coloring in the lines, I just decide I'm going to just paint over everything. All right. Traditionally, that would screw up the entire thing, right? But with a layer mode, what we can do, select the layer that you're painting on, go here, and where it says normal, you could change the opacity and see through, which is okay. It kind of dims the drawing underneath, the way it blends it with the color on top, and this is not the actual color I was painting with, right? So I may not want that. But if I go to darken, now it keeps the black of the drawing and it kind of blends it in, but it does some weird stuff here, okay? It kind of does what we want. It lets us see some of our drawing underneath, but it colors it in a really bizarre way. So instead of darken, I'll use multiply. And what that does is it gives us this really nice natural blend between the black and the paint. So then what I can do is I can just go in, and I'm not worried so much about painting inside the lines anymore. I can real quickly go in and work more naturally and without so many reservations as to, I might screw up something. So really quickly, and this is where, if I put enough detail in my original drawing, I get more to start with. I've already got shading now, right? So pretty quickly, I'm able to go in and get the face painted here. But I'm really leaning heavily on my drawing and all the work I did on the drawing to create some detail to start with. Okay? All right, so, and again, we can turn that on and off, and we haven't negatively affected the background. Now, that's what it looks like without the background. So, I'm not putting in a ton of work getting this just right. It's a pretty, if I just look at the paint layer, it's pretty awful, right? But I'm using it in conjunction with the drawing underneath. The other thing is, because I'm on my own layer, I can pick a color, and let's say I decide that's too dark. Well, I could go in and get a lighter color and go back and paint it all over. But because I've got just this flesh color on its own layer, and let's call this flesh. We'll double click on that name and rename it. Call it flesh. If I don't like that color, instead of repainting it, what I can do is I can go to Image, Adjustments, go to Hue and Saturation, and here I can adjust the hue of the color. If it's too red, we can go a little more toward blue. If it's too dark, we can go lighter. If it's not dark enough, we can go darker. If it's too saturated, we can take it out. If it's not, so we can get the color just exactly where we want it here after the fact. Okay. So really quickly, we've gone from this to this. And then I can always go back and tweak it some more. So what I might do on this one is, I might do all of the flesh on one layer. Now I've changed it, so I want to use my Option key on my keyboard. You'll notice that changes the cursor to an eyedrop, and then I'll click on the flesh color, and then I can go back and get a big brush. And I'll also encourage you to zoom in on your work when you're working. Okay, a lot of students, people just starting out, do not use the zoom option. Typically, it's a lot easier to kind of get good quick coverage when you're zoomed in like that. The other cool thing about this is, if I make a mistake and go outside the lines using this technique, like I did here, all I've got to do is get my eraser and go in, and I can erase it, and I'm not screwing anything up, right? Let's go ahead and do this real quick. Okay, so let's say that's all the flesh we're going to do, and we like the color tone and everything, so we'll leave it at that. Now I want to work on his hair. We'll use the same technique. I could go in, and I could use this same layer and start working on it, right? So I could pick my color and go in and start painting. But what that does is, if I want to change that color, I can't really do that hue and saturation without affecting both colors. So what I'll do instead is I'll create a new layer, double click, call it hair. And I think I want kind of a bluish tint to this, so I'll pick my blue. Okay. So I start painting and I notice that my layer is covering everything. I want to make sure I go to normal and do multiply. And I'm using a tablet, so I've got pressure sensitivity on my pen, which means the more pressure I put on the pen, the wider that line gets, which is really nice to have. So it's a much more natural way of working. Something else you can do in Photoshop is, sometimes certain angles are weird to draw at. If you were drawing on paper, you might turn your paper, right? Rotate it. In Photoshop, if you hit the R key, it will let you rotate your screen. And then we get our brush back. Then the other handy tool is if you hit the space bar, you get the icon with the hand, and that'll let you click and move that, right? Now, as I'm painting this, I've got a lot of shading in the beard and the hair. We've got a lot of different values, and what you're seeing is that stuff is coming through in the transparency of the multiply layer, right? So I'm getting darker values and lighter values depending on the drawing underneath. And then I'm going to hit the R key to go back. And then if I hold down the Shift key while I'm rotating, it constrains it to certain degrees. And that'll get us back to the original. So there, we've quickly gone in and painted the hair. We can go ahead and get the eyebrows too. Okay, so I don't like that purple, right? It's more of a purple blue. So again, because it's on its own layer here, I can go and I can do an adjustment using hue and saturation. Now I can do that another way too, that gives me even a little bit more control. So if you look at the layer, here is the layer with hair. If I go to image or do layer and go to new adjustment layer, like under image, you've got all these ways to adjust your color. In layer adjustment layer, you have those same ways. But what it does, it assigns that adjustment to a layer, a particular layer. In this case, the one I've got selected. And you can see it's selected by the light gray. I'll do a new hue and saturation, but use an adjustment layer this time. And it will ask me if I want to name it, and I could go and call it hair, hue and saturation. And this box right here, use the previous layer to create a clipping mask. What this does is it confines the adjustment I'm about to make to the layer that's directly below. So when I click on that and hit OK, you'll see that this new layer appears and it points down at the layer below. Okay. What I can do then is adjust the properties here. Okay. And they only apply to what's below. And let's see, I think if I bring this down a little more, then I've got a few more, yeah, I can access. So here I can get that to a nice kind of a gray blue. It's not so garish. But that only affects the layer it's directly above. And then if I decide, well, I don't like that, I want to go back to the original. If I've changed it a bunch, it's, you know, too hard to get back to. But now I can just turn that off, and I'm back to the original. By clicking the eye icon, I can turn that off. All right. So that's really handy, as it gives you some more kind of safeguards against screwing things up that you can't undo. So that's just another way to do a hue and saturation adjustment, but it confines it to just this one layer. So already, because I've done so much shading and detail work in the drawing, I'm starting to get some good dimensionality on things, right? It's starting to feel like it's got some texture to it. It's not just flat, okay? So that's how I would approach all of the local color. And local color, the way to explain that is it's the color that a thing is, okay? So if I've got a blue shirt on, the local color is the blue of the shirt. Then you have shadow and highlight, which are variations in tone of the local color. So the local color for the character of the flesh is this particular color. Think of it like a flat color. Okay, if we take out all the lighting and it's something that's just shown without any shadow or light, it's that flat color. Think of like a piece of construction paper. That's a flat color. Same idea. I like to go and do all my flat colors, all my local color first. Then what I'll do is I'll go in and do a new layer for shadows, and I'll do a new layer for highlights. So let's go ahead and create a new layer. I'm going to call this shadows. And sometimes I'll have one shadow layer, and sometimes I'll have a bunch, depending on the complexity of the illustration. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to pick a color for my shadows. So I might option click to get that flesh color back. And then up here in the palette, I might just go a little darker. And I'll get a good brush here with a softer edge. What's that look like? That's good. And that's got some different opacity depending on the pressure. If you're using a mouse, it's going to be a solid opacity, but if you're using a pen, depending on your pressure, you'll get a different level of opacity. So I'm going to use that. And in my drawing, I've got where shadows should be. So I'm going to go in and make my brush a little smaller. And again, I haven't set my layer mode yet, but that's okay. I can fix that later. But I'm getting like this overpaint on stuff. But I know where my shadows are because of my drawing. So I can go in and start to work on that. And I'll maybe put a little shadow in here. Another here. And then, you know, some of this is going to come down to your familiarity with painting. I'm using traditional techniques, but using them digitally. Painting a shadow digitally is the same as painting it traditionally. You need to know how it lays and where it goes and all of that. And I'm going to go in and do like a larger one here to create some of these bigger, bulkier shadows. So, I change my brush size a lot depending on what I'm doing. And I'm kind of creating form by where I'm putting my shadows. Now, I also know I'm going to go in and I'm going to put in highlights too, so I'm trying to keep that in mind of where that stuff's going to go. And I might just do some real soft shadows in places. Okay, so now we've got some shadow in, and it's way too dark. Okay, I know that, but I also know it's on its own layer, so I can do a couple things. Again, we were using just the normal mode, so it's kind of covering up some of that detail underneath, right? So if I switch this to multiply, it blends it in and the color changes, right? So that may not be the color I want to use. So what I can do is go to Image Adjustments, Hue and Saturation, and I can start to play around with my color and saturation. And that's, still way too much. But that color tone, that orangish, more orange brown, works better. If I lighten that up a little bit, that feels like a better color tone, right? So that versus that. And again, that's because we're working on our own layer. I could have also done that with an adjustment layer and come back and work on that some more. Okay. So that's how I would go in and do all my shadows on stuff. Now, these edges aren't as soft as I might like, so I'll go in and get my blur or smudge tool, either one. So with the smudge tool, I'm going to go in and pick a soft brush and the size down. And I'm just going to kind of get an even smaller brush. And so it moves a lot of it at once. There's a setting up here at the top called strength. If I turn this down, it is less powerful. So that gives me a little more fine control over all of this. Okay, and I can blend it back up and soften it. And I can go in and kind of blend it in under the hair and get a little bit of a shadow there. And then if I decide that's still too intense in areas, I can go to my layer and I can then adjust my opacity down a little more. Now that affects everything overall, which I might not want. So what I can do is get my eraser tool. And get a softer edge brush here. Take my opacity down to like 15, 16. Get a larger brush. And I can start to take some of that away and make it a little more subtle. Then I can do the same down here, and I can go back and blend some of that in, some of those edges, and maybe increase the strength of that some. And it depends. I might like those harder edges, or I might want that softer edge. That's really a stylistic choice. So now, and what I like to do when I'm working is toggle this on and off to see the difference. And again, it's maybe a little harsh still, so I might adjust that some more. Or I might go back and even adjust the color a little bit more. But that's how, I'll approach my shadows. And then I might do a new shadow layer for each element. Like I might do a shadow layer for his shirt, for his kilt, or for his shoes or whatever. Okay, so we've done the shadows, and then what you want to do is the same thing with highlights. That's typically what I'll do. So we've got a shadow layer. I'll create a new layer that's called highlights. Now typically, a highlight is going to be a lighter version of the local color. Okay, so you could go in and search and search and search and try to find a good color for that. And that might be okay. You know, that might be the right color. But the way I like to work is just get plain old white and get my brush for this. And then I'll go in and just put those in. It's my highlights. And again, this is a stylistic thing. Now the white is not as subtle as I want it to be, right? But I know I can change all that stuff later. And I need to know where the highlights should go, and that's part of, I'm relying on my knowledge of painting and illustration and the way light falls and all that stuff, just from doing this for a long time. So we got that, and those are pretty harsh. So I might go in now with a brush that's softer, a little bit larger, and adjust my opacity, and go even a little bit smaller maybe. And I may or may not like that, I don't know. But we'll just see. And I also might decide to go in and get my smudge tool. And smudge that a little bit. Just to soften those up. And again, zoom in and zoom out to help get a good sense of what's working. It's always kind of good to change your view on stuff to see what's working all the way up that close might not work as well far off. So it's about finding the balance. So that would be our highlight. And again, I'll turn that on and turn it off. That's okay, but that white is just really harsh. So what I can do is play around with these modes. Now darken and multiply won't do anything because the way they work is they work on colors that are lighter than the color beneath them and how they interact. In this case, we want to work on a color that is lighter. We want it to be lighter than the color that's underneath, if that makes sense. So if you go to lighten and screen, there's one, overlay is one, you'll see some real subtle changes. Okay. Now overlay, if you look at the difference between changing that to screen versus normal, not a huge change. But overlay, we get a little bit of color. Like in this area here, if we look at overlay, it picks up a little bit of a yellow in here, which is kind of nice. That's giving us some color we didn't have to think about, right? Which is more natural. You might pick up some more yellows in a highlight in a flesh color. So all of these modes will just interact with different ways, and rather than try to explain how they work, the best thing you can do is play around with them and see what they do. All right. Now typically if you're trying to lighten something with a highlight, you would use overlay, lighten, or screen. I like overlay for this. Then I can still go back and adjust the opacity for subtlety, which that's kind of nice. If I turn both of those off, there we are with the flat color. Here we are with shadows, and there we are with highlights. Okay. So we were able to get some nice detail and texture and form into this without having to do a lot of extra work. Again, because I'm relying on some of the stuff I put in my drawing, but also I'm able to go in and work on these separate layers, which gives me control. Okay. Now, if I were doing this without doing a tutorial, this would have taken about 3 minutes to do that because of the way this technique works. So you can be really fast and efficient when you're working like this. And so then hopefully, ultimately, what you would get to is a point where you're more at something like this, right? Where we've gone in and we've done all that same work with the highlights and shadows. I've played around with some of the different brushes in Photoshop to get different texture. You might want to try that. But this is a more refined version of that example, where we've got some painting done in the shirt and elsewhere, but it's all the same technique that I've used, right? And this one has been flattened to a single layer. Okay, but again, that's kind of the technique we're going to be using all semester. Now we're going to be adding to that as we go, but kind of mastering the idea of working with layers and layer modes is the key to everything this semester. So really spend your time working on the technique, and I think you'll do well. Typically, once people figure this out, they do really, really well with work. And also, consider the drawing you start out with, how much detail and how much information you put in your starting drawing will matter. Okay, so that's the basic technique. Hopefully that explains everything. The Paul Bunyan PDF kind of goes over this again in the link in the tutorials folder. So hopefully this is useful to you, and yeah, that's the basic technique. And then what you do when you're finished, to submit it, you're going to go to File and Save As, and you would save it as a, actually, newest version of Photoshop. You'll have to go to File, and you'll have to go to Export As, and you will select a JPEG. Leave it at its existing size, and don't worry about this stuff, and then export it with your name, the proper naming convention, to your wherever you're saving stuff, and then that's what you'll that's what you'll upload to Brightspace. All right, so there's that demo for Project 1. Okay, have a good week, and I hope this works well for you, and just give me a shout if you have any questions. Thanks.